Code refactored? Very good. Hopefully it's much nicer and easier to understand now, and you got all kinds of cool ideas what else you might want to do it and how you can now much easier extend its functionality. I'll briefly walk you through what I have done to refactor my code. And just keep in mind that, as always, this is not the only solution. This is one example solution. You could have done this in a different way as well. Okay, what have I done? Well, I have created this new function gear. I have simply called this gear instead of create gear because I like short function names, and gear is still somewhat intuitive. It tells me what the function does. It takes two arguments, the number of spokes and the radius. And this here is really the code that we had before with some very minor changes. What are these changes? Well, first of all, I'm now taking the radius that I'm being passed as an argument to the function to create these cylinders and also to create the inner radius here. So I'm computing this as 2/3 of the outer radius. Again, not the only way of doing this. You could also say that, well, the radius that is being passed, that is actually the inner radius, and I'm going to compute a larger outer radius based on that. Or maybe you want to introduce a third argument that allows you to specify both the inner radius and the outer radius explicitly. All of that is perfectly fine. And then, as we saw before in the previous exercise, we're now running this loop for spokes number times, and we're using that same variable here to compute the difference in angle between the different spokes. In addition to that, I'm also computing the spoke length here based on the radius that was being passed in. And I have actually slightly changed how this code works, because now instead of decreasing the length of the spoke when this condition here is true, I am increasing it. Again, only my particular implementation. If you want to do this in a different way, also perfectly fine, also perfectly valid. The rest of it is really exactly the same as before. So we have this code here that adds one more spoke to this variable spokes here that holds all of them. And in the end, we return the union of the outer circle, the inner circle, and the spokes subtracted the inner radius cylinder, such that we don't get spokes that reach into the middle here. And now all I need to do in the main function down here is call this newly created function. The first argument being the number of spokes and the second one being the radius. This now means that it is very easy for me to change what is actually created. Let's say I want to have 20 spokes instead of 10. All I need to change is this number here. And there we go. We now have 20 spokes. Maybe I want to change the radius. I want to make this bigger. Let's make it 25 instead of 15. All I have to change is this number here. Now, to some extent, I was able to do that before. In particular, if I have taken all of those things that I might want to change and put them out into variables, but I can now do something different that I wasn't able to do before. I can create a second gear using the same function without having to write the same code again. So let's have a brief look at that. I will, as I said, we can only return individual elements from this function, individual things. So I need to union this gear here with my new gear. For this, I can, of course, use the union function, and I will create a second gear. I will make this a bit larger, let's say 25 spokes and a radius of 50. And oops, closing parenthesis here. Let's run this. There we go. I've now created two gears without having to duplicate any code. I'm simply calling the same function again. Of course, this works an arbitrary number of times. I could now put this inside a loop and create 10 gears or 20 or 100. And every time I want to do this, I only need to call this gear function here with different parameters without having to change anything else, without having to go inside the code of the actual function here and start modifying things there. So a very nice way of reusing code that you have written for different purposes, a very nice way of putting things into modules. In JavaScript, we do this through this function here, and we will have a look at what else we can do with functions later on, how we can leverage this to do even more complex and sophisticated things. Of course, you have all already used functions. For example, cube here, that's a function. Rotate, that's a function. Union, that's also a function. And the behavior of these functions is entirely determined by the arguments. The implementation, the code behind it, doesn't need to change if you pass it different arguments. You don't need to re-implement this. And in particular, you can use it without even knowing how this is implemented. All you need to know is what it does. In the same way, all you really need to know is what your gear function here does. You don't need to give this implementation to anybody else. So a very nice way of being able to give your code to somebody else who can then use it without necessarily understanding all the intricacies of it.